Okay, so hi, everybody. Welcome. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight the author of He Gets That From Me, a book many of us just finished reading, and maybe some of us haven't read it yet. But Jackie Friedland is with us tonight, and we had a very lively discussion about the book earlier today, some of us. And so I know we're very eager to hear what Jackie has to say. So Jacqueline Friedland graduated magna cum laude from both the University of Pennsylvania and NYU Law School. She practiced as a commercial litigator at the New York law firms of, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Debevoise and Plimpton LLP and Boyes, Schiller and Flexner LLP. Maybe I'm close enough.
You did well.
Okay. So after determining that office life did not suit her, Jackie began teaching legal writing and lawyering skills at the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law in Manhattan and working on her first book in her limited spare time. Finally deciding to embrace her passion and pursuing writing full-time, Jackie returned to school to earn her Master's of Fine Arts from Sarah Lawrence College, graduating from the program in 2016. When not writing, she's an avid reader of all things fiction. She loves to exercise, watch movies with her family, listen to music, make lists, and dream about exotic vacations. I'm sure even more so with probably having been grounded for the past 2 years. Yep. She lives in Westchester and in Scarsdale, as it turns out, with her husband, 4 children, and 2 very bossy canines. And just before I turn it over to Jackie, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Marcia Appel. Many of you know me, some of you may not. And the Rabbi, Alyssa Mendelson, who usually runs this meeting, is right now traveling in Israel. She was in Haifa as of this afternoon, I believe. And so you've got me for tonight.
Hi, everybody. I am Jackie Friedland. So happy to be here talking with you all tonight. It's raining like crazy outside my window, so I hope that the thunder will not become overpowering and prevent us from hearing each other. But although I live in Scarsdale now, I was actually born and raised in Syosset, where I spent my entire childhood. And I have a real fondness for all things Long Island. I actually did not go to Syosset High School. I went to Friends Academy. So I actually had a lot of Port Washington kids in my grade at school and was in your area frequently as a kid. So to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to write this book, which the book that Marcia held up, it actually initially had a different cover. That I happen to have loved the original cover. And before the book went to the final printing press, the sales team decided the cover was no good and we had to change it. And we went through many iterations and ended up with this cover, which probably most of you had. And I happen to love this cover as well, but I was happy to see that bright, colorful one from the past. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania and I was an English major. And when I hit late junior year of college, and everybody said, so what are you going to do when you graduate? I kind of stared blankly at them and said, and I went to meet with my college advisor, who was an English professor, and told him that I thought I wanted to get a PhD in English and become a professor. And he said to me, this is because you want to teach English? And I said, yes. And he said, well, if you become a university professor, most of your time will not actually be spent teaching. It will be spent writing scholarly articles and trying to get published and vying for tenure and dealing with university politics. And you'll teach some. And, you know, if you get one of the few jobs that are out there, that'll be great, but you won't earn any money and you'll work yourself half to death. So if there's anything else you think you might like to do, you should do that. So I relayed all of this to my parents and they said, you should go to law school. And I said, I'm not really interested in law. And they said, you know what, go to law school. You'll be qualified to do anything. And I said, you know what, okay, if I go to law school and I hate it, there's a big chance I'll always come back to something related to English or literature. But if I start out with the English and it doesn't work out, I'm never going to go to law school when I'm middle-aged, or, do anything like a whole new career path. So I went for it, and I went to law school, and it turned out I liked law school, and I got a job at a law firm. And from day one of when I stepped into that firm, it was sort of like, oh my goodness, what have I done? And I just always felt like I was playing dress up. Like I would put on my lawyer clothes and go to the office and pretend to be a lawyer. And I never felt invested at all in any of the cases that I was working on. I felt like I was a cog in a wheel. And perhaps if I had had a different experience and gone to a smaller firm, or chosen something other than commercial litigation and done maybe family law, or adoption law, or surrogacy law, which is now a field, I might have been a little bit more fulfilled personally. I know there are lawyers who love their jobs and it's wonderful for them, but for me, it was a square peg in a round hole from minute one. And I got married sort of right around the time that I started working as a lawyer. And when we had our first child, I guess it was about 2 years later, and I started my nice long maternity leave. One of the perks of being an attorney is your nice long maternity leave. And I thought to myself, you know what, if I could write a book on maternity leave, I don't have to be a lawyer anymore. So little did I know that you can't do anything with an infant. I couldn't put the child down. I couldn't take a shower. I couldn't get a decent night's rest, much less write a novel. But I didn't know anyone else with babies. It was a learning curve. And I did, however, at that moment, get the bug. And I said, you know what, this is something I always sort of dreamed of as a little girl. And it was in the same realm as being a rock star. It sounded really cool to do it, but nobody actually does that. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to write a book in the time of like when the baby's sleeping and nights and weekends. And I started, and when I went back to my law firm, it was this like great escape when I would come home at night and we would get the baby to bed, and I would write, a paragraph if I was lucky in one night. And over time, I started to develop this draft, but I also began to realize that I was 26 years old, and I felt at the time that I had very limited life experience and was sort of struggling to pull enough together to make the book what it should be. And so I turned my focus to historical fiction, because I felt like historical fiction was so rife with it was almost like a cheat sheet. All these interesting things happened and you could build a story around it. And so I started doing all this historical research, and I ended up writing a book about the pre-Civil War South. It's basically a love story, and it has to do with abolition and a young woman from Britain who comes and lives with a man in South Carolina, who turns out, unbeknownst to her, to be an abolitionist, and she gets involved in all of these unexpected dilemmas. And I got this book written and realized that it was not good. And I needed some guidance. I had never, for all of the majoring in English I had done, I had never taken a creative writing class. It had all been expository essays and picking apart other people's writing as opposed to working on any writing of my own. So that was the time I decided I wanted to go back to school and study creative writing. So I first started teaching legal writing at Cardozo because that was a very sort of part-time gig, and I was having my kids at the time. I have 4 children, and when I got we sort of pumped them out in quick succession. And when I got pregnant with my 4th, my older sister, who's also an attorney, said to me, "You realize that you can't be a full-time attorney with 4 kids who are 6 years apart, right?" And I kind of said, like, yeah, I guess you're right. And so I applied to the master's programs and was very excited to get into Sarah Lawrence because it's right near my house. And I thought to myself, like, this is it. I'm going to go and I'm going to write my novels in school and it's going to be wonderful. But it turned out when you go to get your master's in creative writing, what you do in the majority of your classes is write short stories. So it's very difficult to be writing a novel while you're also writing short stories because, you have like homework for school. And there's just sort of too much going on. However, I did learn a lot, and I was suddenly surrounded by all of these other people who loved writing as much as I did. And the people who go to these writing programs, for the most part, have all tried to do something else first, but they can't help themselves. They need to write. So I finally began to feel like I was finding my people. And when I graduated from the program, the last portion of the program is that you write your thesis, and the thesis can be the beginning of a book. So I rewrote that abolition book as my thesis. And when I graduated from the program, it took me about another 6 months to kind of get it into shape. And I published it as my first book shortly thereafter. And then I said, okay, now I'm an author, and I was ready to hit the ground running. And I said, not only that, 10 years had gotten by since I first began it. And now I felt like, you know what, I did actually have a little bit more life experience, and I was going to try my hand at some contemporary fiction. So I wrote my second novel, which is called That's Not a Thing. And it's contemporary romance. And it's based loosely on the story of my mother's first engagement that broke off 3 weeks before the wedding. And in my head as a child, it was always sort of this fairy tale that the man who got away, and I made up all these just scenarios in my head, and I needed to create a story around it. And I was that book, I got it out. I wrote the whole thing in 9 months. It was done. It was ready to go, and super excited about it. And I got my publication date of April 2020. And when the book came out, when it was coming, I called my publisher and I said, first I said, we should release it early because everybody's going to be home for 2 weeks. And, in March of 2020. And they said, wait, we can't, we're not going to be able to get it ready in time. We still have the printing and the cover and the everything. So then the 2 weeks went by and I called them again and I said, maybe we should delay the release of the book. Maybe now's not the time. And they said, no, we have to maintain our schedule and it's going to come out. And I just remember, just to flash backwards a little, my husband and I got engaged on September 10th, 2001, the night before September 11th, because, who knew what was about to happen the next day. And it was the most indescribable feeling to be walking through the city the next day, the day after, bumping into friends on the street because everyone was outside, there were no cars anymore on the streets, and it was like you wanted to say like, hey, we got engaged, but you also didn't want to share your good news. And it was like deja vu when my book was coming out and we were at like the start of COVID and everybody was fearing for their lives. And I had this book, but it wasn't really important, but it was important to me. And so it was a very strange, surreal experience. I didn't promote it very much. I kind of said, what, maybe someone we'll talk about it later, was kind of my attitude about it. So for my third book, I was in this strange place now of, my journey just was not, in no way was what I had expected it to be. And so I was working on a few different things, a few different ideas percolating, and I was struggling to propel myself forward. And one afternoon, I was procrastinating and reading news online, as you do. And I think it must have been People or some comparable publication that I was reading on the internet. And I stumbled on this article about a woman who served as a surrogate mother, an American woman served as a surrogate mother for a couple from China. And when she conceived, she was carrying twins. And when she gave birth and the babies came out, one of the babies appeared to be Chinese, like the intended parents, and the other baby appeared to be Black, like the husband of the gestational carrier. And even so, they sent both babies home to China with the intended parents. But everybody who had been involved kind of thought on it for a little, and they started doing some genetic tests. And they finally, after about a month, understood that what had happened was that the surrogate had gotten pregnant with the genetic material from the Chinese couple and was carrying one baby. And then she had intercourse with her husband and became pregnant a second time and was carrying these two babies. They sometimes call them, they're not twins, they're twiblings. And it just was a big surprise to everybody. And so they ended up, the Chinese baby stayed with the Chinese parents, the American baby stayed with the American parents, and they worked it all out in the end. But so I'm reading this article and I'm like, wait, but she was already pregnant. How did she get pregnant again? And I know that you can't, this doesn't happen. So I'm immediately on Googling it. And it turns out there is this situation people can get into called superfetation, which is the phenomenon of getting pregnant when one is already pregnant. And it's a real thing. And it's just so incredibly rare that nobody ever teaches you about it. And it's rare enough to be nearly irrelevant. However, what I did learn reading about it is that they actually think a lot of fraternal twins may be conceived this way. And that they just haven't proved it conclusively, and for whatever reason, they haven't needed to. So I'm thinking about it, that, for days after, just sort of shell-shocked I really made an impression on me. And then I got to thinking, wait, what would have happened if every party involved in this scenario had been the same race and the babies came out, nobody would have known, and the two babies go home to China or wherever it may be. And if there's no reason to do a DNA test, they would never know. And, a woman could have a child out there that she knows nothing about. And it wowed me. And I chills head to toe, knew I had to write this book. And it was immediately, it all came to me and my fingers were on the keyboard and I had my characters just popped into being almost immediately as soon as I realized that this was the story. And especially because one of the things they tell you over and over as a writer is to write what you know. And one of the things that I do feel I know is how it feels to be a parent. I don't necessarily know how to parent well, but I know how it feels to be a parent. And it got me to thinking, what would I do in that situation? You always hear about men who find out they have children they didn't know about. You never hear a woman who discovers she had a child she didn't know about. And, I have this family of 4. And if someone were to tell me you have another kid out there, we're a unit now. I'm sorry, 4 kids. But we're a unit of 6, and would we want to bring another child in? But how could we not bring that other child in? And how could we leave them with the other parents? But how could we take them from the other parents? And so that was the inspiration for this book. And I have to say that since I wrote it, the feedback that I have gotten has been really cool. I have heard from many, many people who have both served as gestational carriers and have had babies through gestational carriers, all sort of pleased with the story, interested by the story. I just recently, though, for the first time, heard from a set of twins who both read the book, because one read it, a boy-girl set of twins, and now they're adults. And the sister read the book and said to her brother, you have to read this book. And they made their own little twin book club to discuss it. And I feel very much that while the book is an exploration of surrogacy and family building and how to create a family in alternative and new ways, it's also an exploration of long time, traditional family dynamics, mother-child, father-child, sibling relationships, grandparent to grandchild relationships. And I really enjoyed writing it, and I'm really glad to be able to be here and discuss it with you all. And if left to my own devices, I can talk and talk and talk. So I'm going to stop here. But I would love to open things up to questions if people would like.
So I'm going to thank you so much. And a couple of points. I love your book titles, by the way.
Thank you.
And speaking of your background as a lawyer, I ought to have mentioned that the rabbi also has a law degree and practiced matrimonial law for a few years before deciding that the rabbinate was where she wanted to be. So more parallels in,
in
your life and hers. So I'm curious how you found your publisher.
It's actually a circuitous answer. So the common practice when you write a book and you want to get your book published is that the first step is you find an agent, and then your agent will take your book to publishers. And, if you're lucky, there will be a bidding war and 3 publishers will say, we want the book. And then they'll say, well, I'll pay this and I'll pay that. And you go with the highest one. That's kind of the dream. And the way you get your agent is you send a 1-page letter that says, here's who I am. Here's what my book's about. Here's why you should want it. And you get 1 page and that's it. And you have to make them, you really got to sell yourself. And mostly it's the assistants of the agents who are reading these letters and kind of, dismissing you. And so that's what I did. I wrote my query letter and I sent it around to, 20 agents or something. And this was with my first book. And I got a lot of interest and I was super excited because you don't hear about that. And, you hear everybody's getting ignored. And I was sure I was going to get published and I was going to be famous and it was going to be amazing. And what the agents do is they say, it sounds interesting, send me the first 20 pages. So I did that. Then they come back and say, great, send me the next 50 pages. And you do that. And it's back and forth. And each little segment takes, 3 weeks or 6 weeks before you hear from them again. And the feedback I got finally from probably 4 or 6 of them was, we liked the book, but it's not quite historical fiction and it's not quite historical romance. It's kind of a combination of the two, and we don't know where we would shelve it. And so you either have to redo it or, we can't make it work. So I then started another round of query letters. I figured, I'm just going to try again with a different group of people. And at the same time, I met a woman whose name is Susie Schnall, who happens to live a few towns over from me, and she's an author. And she said, oh, you should reach out to my publisher. You don't need an agent. So it's a small publisher called Spark Press. And I looked at their website and followed their instructions, and you literally submit through a form on the internet, and they came back to me and wanted the whole book to read it. And then they came back again and said that it was 27,000 words too long, but if I could get rid of those words, they would do it. So I said, yes, anything you want, I'll do whatever you want. And I cut out 1 full chapter and then went through the book and got rid of every possible extra word. And I was, I got 27,001 words out and gave it back, and they published it. And I, at the time, sort of thought that I was settling because, they're this small house and everyone wants to be at the big, they call them the big 5 of traditional, Simon & Schuster, Putnam, St. Martin's, etc. And I have since discovered that I have sold just as many books at my small hybrid publisher as friends of mine who are at the big houses, if not more. And because of the structure of this publisher, you don't get the advance up front, but what you do get is a more favorable royalty split. So where friends are getting, 25 to 45, maybe 50 if they're lucky % of their royalties. My first book, it was 80 and 60, depending on ebook or print book. And so I was really excited about this and very happy to discover that I had actually made a good choice. And the publisher who I'm with, they publish mostly women, not exclusively, but just, majority. And it's very small and personal, and I get a lot of editorial control. They will, if they say to me about a book, we think you should change X, Y, and Z. And I say, well, I'll do X and Z, but I'm not doing Y. They sort of say, okay, it's your book. And it was the same thing, like how I told you, we changed the cover. When they came back to me with, here's our new cover. I hate to ever cause a problem, and I hated the cover they sent. And I sort of was like, well, it's okay, it'll be fine. And then I slept on it and said, you know what, it's my book that I worked on for so long and so hard, and I just hate the cover. And I went back and I said, can we change it? I'm so sorry. And they, of course, we'll change it. They came back with 6 options. So it's been quite a pleasure for me. I published all 3 books with them. I have a 4th coming in the fall of 2023 also with them. And I sing their praises. I do their advertising whenever another publisher, another author is thinking about using them. I get the phone call, will you talk to this person? You know? So yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, so I'm going to put this on gallery, which I hope everybody can see everybody. So anybody have any questions? Gail, you had something you were thinking about before. Can you unmute?
Yeah. So I was thinking about how long it took before they found out that the twins were genetically not brothers and not related. And I just started thinking, like, what would have happened if people really had to do genetic testing and found out sooner? Because it's a long time to have, people live with somebody, and then take them away. But really, it is her child. Like, so I kind of felt a little bad for the mother who couldn't really have her child. But then again, like after 10 years, how are you going to rip the kid away from the family? So anyway, did you think about making it younger, or would it have been different, or why did you choose for them to be 10 before this all came out?
So multiple reasons, actually. So first of all, from watching several children, my own and others who I know go through elementary school, fifth grade seems to be the year that the vast majority of them do their family tree project, and they start learning about ancestors and where they came from. So that was one reason, and the other was because I think 10 years old is a really interesting age. They always say 7 is the age of reason, where kids sort of begin to think and negotiate and question. But to me, they're still such babies at 7. But at 10, there's this little bit of independence growing in them, where you wouldn't leave them home alone, but you could, and they might be okay. And it seemed like long enough that the child would be like a little mini adult with this life that they've formed, but young enough that they still have a lot of their childhood left. I thought if the kids were too young, it made it seem a little bit more, to me, made it seem a little bit more obvious that they should perhaps send Kai back to his biological mother. But by 10, I think 10 is it's like the middle of childhood. And so I felt like it made it really murky. And that was kind of why I chose that age. Meanwhile, a lot of people have asked me at events like these if I myself have done the DNA testing, and I have to confess that I have not. My mother has made me promise her that I won't, and she says you don't want your information out there in a database. So I took this on faith for a little while, and then I sort of said, you know what, this is sort of sketchy. Why don't you want me to do DNA testing? The good news is I look almost identical to my father, but and my father has done the DNA testing, and it not surprisingly came back and said that he was 99% Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jewish, and I found that very disappointing and not exotic at all. And the company he did it with, Ancestry, and they called him a couple years after the initial test and said that they had fine-tuned their testing, and it turned out that he's also 1% Irish. And I got so excited. I said, I knew it. I've always been obsessed with Ireland. I just think it's so cool and fun. And I wanted my green t-shirt with the clover on it. And then he got an email follow-up a year later that it was wrong, that no Irish. So I'm just accepting the 99% Ashkenazi Jewish as what it is.
Okay. Nancy, you had a question about, or you wanted to explore the science of it a little more?
Yeah, well, I think that Jackie kind of explained it there at the beginning, that, it's, I don't think any of us had ever thought that this would be possible, that you could get pregnant when you're already pregnant. So that aspect of it really interested me. And as Jackie said, who would think about it, because both kids are coming out looking the way they should be.
Yeah.
Not as obvious as the as the Chinese couple. I mean, that must have been quite a shock.
It's funny. We have friends who had a baby, I think last night basically, and they sent out a picture, and I showed my 11-year-old daughter, and I said, look how cute the baby is. And she said, he looks exactly like every other baby. They all look the same. So, and it made me think about, this issue of you take two babies who are the same race, they do look exactly the same to, somebody who's not really studying them. So, but one thing that's also interesting about the science of it is that when they do surrogacy, a lot of times the women who are going to carry the babies take a lot of hormones, and to make their bodies more hospitable to the implantation and to carrying the baby. And sometimes, depending on how they do it, it can make the possibility of this superfetation even greater. So, and it's actually, since I began writing this book, which I think I began, it was before COVID started, but not that long. So, call it 2019. And since that time, the number of news articles that I have seen in different publications about similar occurrences has continued to grow, as have the articles about just crazy surrogacy situations. There was one woman who they switched, two women went to the same clinic, and they switched the embryos by accident, and they implanted each surrogate with the wrong embryo. And when the babies were born again, it was the only reason they knew was because it was different races. And it turned out these two families lived not far, like 15 minutes or 10 minutes from each other. And after, it took 3 months, I think, if I'm remembering, before they figured everything out and dealt with the clinic, and they switched the babies back to their intended families. But there were older siblings, like little toddlers in the family, who were both very upset because they had begun to get attached to these infants. And so when the article came out, it said that the families were getting together for all the holidays and the birthdays. I'm curious to see, 10, 15 years from now, if they still continue to do so. But I thought that was interesting. And then another scenario was because of COVID, there's a lot of international surrogacy that happens. And there was a woman in America who served as a surrogate for a couple, I don't remember where, but some foreign country. And she had this one baby for the other couple, and then she couldn't give them the baby because travel was restricted. And so when the article came out, she had been watching this baby for like 9 or 10 months already. And the press kept saying to her, aren't you going to want to keep the baby? Aren't you getting attached to the baby? And she actually said, no, I'm watching the baby. I'm like the babysitter watching the baby for his parents. And eventually they'll come and get him. But it's just sort of interesting, all of the scenarios that can be created that you never expect beforehand. Which I suppose it happens without surrogacy too. Children will surprise you and create all sorts of unexpected circumstances. So.
I did just want to say, pick up on what Gail said before about your choice of Kai being 10. Because I thought that was a very interesting choice, because 10 is old enough to have been with this family, to have been formed by the family, to have made the bonds with the family, all those formative years. And yet 10 is not really old enough for that kid to make a decision. And so I think by doing that, you introduce this whole gray area. Should he go back to the biological mother? Should he stay where he is, which has been his only family? Is it better to be in a family with a mother and a father rather than two men? So I thought that was a very interesting aspect of the book. And I think that was essential to the book in terms of all of the themes that you were exploring.
I tried to bring in a lot of gray area throughout the story. I think it's a story made up of gray area, even in the relationships between the couples, especially like Nick and Maggie. I was very intent on showing a complicated marriage, one that was neither great nor awful. And also with Donovan and his husband, because they had on some level very sweet relationship and very perfect, and on another they were sort of polar opposites, and it got murky for them. So yeah, lots of gray area. I agree.
Anybody else?
Oh, yeah, I see. Hold on. Is that-
Yes, no?
Yeah, I've got a question. Yeah, first of all, let me say, I had the same experience as your dad. I was 1% Irish for a couple
Oh.
of years.
Oh, and
we
then they
had-
took it back from you?
They took it back, but
Oh,
we
man.
had some really great St. Patrick's Days while it lasted. So I enjoyed reading the book. I was not a big fan of Maggie, I have to say. I just did not like that character. But that was my personal feeling there. But I'm wondering, when you started the book, did you know where you were going with it? Did you think about other endings? And if so, why did you pick this one?
Good question.
So, first of all, the fact that we were both briefly Irish and are no longer makes me wonder if we're related. But putting that aside, so when I began the book, I thought from the beginning that Kai was going to stay with his fathers. But then as I was writing it and sort of felt myself getting deeper inside Maggie's mind and deeper inside Donovan's mind, I began to second guess, which I think it's reflected in the story that, you think you feel one way and then you sort of see the other side of why it might actually be better to go the other way. And I think Maggie is in many ways an unlikable character, but I think she's also very human and very honest. And so you sort of see all of the bad parts of her. She shows her warts throughout the story, and she is selfish, and she does put herself first in a lot of the scenarios. But I also think that one of the things that sort of dawned on me while I was writing the book is that I think parenting is actually a very selfish act in a lot of ways, and that we as parents often put, the expectations we put on our children, the things we want for them, is it because we want it for ourselves, and why do we want it? And should my daughter ice skate because I always wanted to ice skate and didn't get to, or whatever it may be? And do we need to feel needed? And do we need to feel important to somebody? And I sort of brought all of those questions out in Maggie. And as I struggled along with her about where should Kai end up, I came back. It was sort of like a brief interlude of maybe he should go home with Maggie, and then no, it makes more sense for him to stay with his dad's. And I did also want to send the message of, that blood is not always thicker than water. That was something I set out to do from the beginning. I have a couple of people in my life, close friends, who have had babies through surrogates and through adoption, and looking at the differences between how this one got their child and how that one got their child and how this one got their child. It's elucidating to see how the bonds form and how it's really not about the blood. And so that was important to me, to let him end up staying with his dad. I will say, I hope everyone read it and I'm not spoiling anything, but the epilogue came to me at about 2/3 through the book. I didn't always know that would be there.
Yeah, I found that surprising. Yep, Bayla?
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned that, because that's what was the one question that first of all, everyone should know that I very fortunately won a copy of the book from Jackie, from a raffle on a book group that we're both in. And she was kind enough to put a book of hers on. I don't know if other people got a copy too. I don't know how many copies, but anyway, I got one. And so we have, Jackie and I have a little Facebook relationship now, which is nice. But, I also wanted to ask about that. And what made you do that, that ending?
So as I was getting deeper into the story, I realized that I had painted Teddy as Kai's protector. And I just started thinking about sibling relationships and how parents think they know their kids so well, and you don't always know what's going on. And so what if it was actually Kai who was protecting Teddy the whole time? And then that got me to thinking, well, Kai wants to stay with his dad's, and how is he going to get out of it? And I wanted to give Kai some agency. I I felt like really at its heart, the book was really about him. And you don't see him, you don't hear from him throughout the book. You hear from Maggie and from Donovan. And so I felt like this was a way to let Kai take control. And it's funny, people either love or they hate the epilogue. I get a lot of that. Like if you look, you're not supposed to read your own reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, but I do because I can't help myself. And if you look at the reviews, it's literally like all like back and forth. I love the epilogue. I hated the epilogue. I love the epilogue. I hated the epilogue. So I'm happy to get a reaction out of people and to make an impression either way, I suppose. And I don't know, I felt like I wanted to see those boys grow up a little bit and to just show people a little bit more of who they were and that maybe it was not what they thought.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay. Getting back to gray areas, there was one part of your book that maybe troubled me a little bit because I think maybe there was a gray area there that shouldn't be, and that was Maggie's relationship with the teacher, which it comes off as, well, maybe he was just a guy that got in over his head and at one time, but meanwhile engaging in very predatory behavior. And I'd like to have your thoughts on that particular piece of the book.
So it was never my intention to make it seem gray. So I apologize if that seemed gray because that teacher was a bad dude. He did a bad thing and possibly didn't pay enough of a price for it. And I think that his bad behavior coupled with Maggie's parents' reaction to it were the two things that sort of set her down a path that she then spent a decade trying to rectify. So he was intended sort of as one of the sources of Maggie's downfall, and not and nothing less. He was a bad guy, and if it was a gray area to anybody, it was maybe that Maggie didn't quite understand when she was a teenager how bad he was. But beyond that, bad guy.
Yeah. Okay, and then to follow up on that, because yeah, as you mentioned, Maggie's an unlikable character. In many ways, not her fault, because if anybody ever needed counseling, it was probably that family. But what is your opinion of the parents then, and what they did? I mean, they were parents, and they were probably trying to do the best they could, but they were also did some very damaging things.
I think that life is hard. And people get put into positions where, hindsight is 2020 and there are things they should have done differently. But I think that for people who are struggling to raise their families and, make it appear as if life is good and everything's okay, I think people, especially parents, make mistakes. And everybody's trying to do the best they can, but I think, especially in homes where there's mental illness, it's difficult. And, one spouse may try to compensate for the other spouse and do it in a way that does more harm than good. And these things they reverberate, with the children for years and onto the grandchildren, really. So that was something I was trying to show with that.
Roberta?
Yeah, just to follow up, I thought, Mark, in the discussion that we had this afternoon, I clearly read the book the way you stated, that the mom, the way she handled the daughter's incident with the teacher, that the teacher's behavior and the mom's response definitely made her life spiral down. But I thought Mark was referring to what was gray was years later when she met the teacher in the music store. She kind of was more it seemed like she was more accepting of that behavior rather than seeing it for what it was. Wasn't that the gist of what you were saying this afternoon, why you thought it was gray? Because prior to that, it wasn't. It was very clear that he was very damaging to her.
Yeah, he was damaging. I guess the problem I had was it almost seemed like, he made this one mistake. What he did was bad, no question about it. But it seemed like he made this one mistake, and maybe he never did anything like this before or since. but that kind of behavior is a pattern normally. And that was just the sense I came away with. You know, he was a poor schlemiel who just screwed up. But, you know, that's just the thing I got from it. You know, the impression I got.
And my view was that he, you know, we don't see what happened to him after he lost his job at the school. And it's so many years later, and Maggie doesn't know. And so none of us know where he's been and what he's been up to and what he's been through or not. And it's sort of to me, her attitude in the music store was more resignation than anything else. That like she just didn't, there were things she didn't want to face, and she had too many other difficult things going on, and his presence really was a device for her to realize that, you know, when he said that he thought he was doing what was best for her at the time and didn't realize until later that it wasn't, you know, to kick her out of the music class, not to come on to her, but that was the moment where Maggie realizes that adults will do what they think is best for a child when they actually have no idea what is best for the child. And that was the device for her to realize that she should stop deciding for Kai and let Kai and try to figure out what is best for Kai. And she didn't want to repeat the mistakes that had been done to her onto her own child. So that was his intended purpose in the book.
Okay. It helps to know that. I had one thing that stuck with me after I finished reading it, and a few days later, you know, a lot of that has to do what you built was that strong sibling relationship that was kind of at the heart of the story in a lot of ways. And I was musing about, you know, well, what if one of the twins had been a girl? And how would that have maybe been different? And how would that have affected Maggie differently? And what would that have meant to her son Wyatt? That maybe, you know, if there was a sister as opposed to a brother. And it just, you know, I spent a lot of time sort of musing about that. I was wondering if you toyed with that scenario.
It's so funny, for all the events I've done for this book, nobody has asked me this. And and it's actually not something that ever crossed my mind. I think maybe I grew up with one sister, and I think I feel very familiar with the same-sex sibling bond. And I have, in my house, I have 3 boys and a girl, and my boys, you know, they're thick as thieves, and my daughter is sort of like her. She's also the youngest, but she's kind of always off doing something separate. And I don't know. I don't see, now, as I'm thinking about it, I sort of feel like it would be on some level much easier to separate them if they were different genders, but at the same rate, it's still siblings. I don't know. I haven't given this any thought.
It's like it would have been a slightly different story somehow.
Yes, it would have been a very different story, because the relationship between them would have been just so different. I mean, it would have been a whole different character than Teddy. It would have been, you know, Teresa or whoever.
Or Kai would have been female, and
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I can tell you, in the first draft of the book, Maggie had 3 kids. Wyatt was the oldest. And then after she and Nick got married a couple of years later, they had 2 more kids. And when I finished that version of the story, it was, I mean, talk about an unlikable character. There's Maggie with her 3 kids trying to take another child away from Chip and Donovan. And so I had to kill the kids and let them only have 1.
That's pretty funny. Okay, any other comments? Okay. I would also add that, you know, your lawyerness sort of shone through in the discussions of the state law, and, you know.
I always said I wasn't going to, when I started this, I said, I'm not going to do that, you know, incorporating law into the book kind of thing. That's not going to happen. And, you know, in the first book, 0 law. The second book, she's a lawyer, but you don't really hear anything about the law. And then the third book, there's actual law. The 4th book has like a whole court case in it. So you never know what you're going to do, I guess, is the moral.
Can you tell us something about the fourth book?
Sure. It's actually, it's historical fiction. And it's about a female abolitionist and a famous runaway slave and how they work together to try to secure his permanent freedom. It's called The Abolitionist.
Okay. And you said that's coming out when?
Next fall, like a year from September. So it's a little while. It's a slow process.
Okay, so if nobody else has any comments, we want to be respectful of your time. And thank you so much for spending an hour with us and kind of deepening the nuances in our understanding of the book, which was fascinating.
Well, it was so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.